Hi, so today we're going to talk about sort of colonial America. So to this point, we've talked about natives, we've talked about sort of the foundation of the colonies, um, but what we're going to talk about today is really sort of the generation prior to the founding of America. So we're really looking at sort of the mid 1700s, mid 18th century, and how life in the colonies played out. So when you look at our colonies, and this is a little bit review, um, one of the things that we see is that the makeup of the colonies was predominantly um, young, relatively poor men. Um, Young because it required a significant amount of labor in order to be successful here. So it was not an old man's game. Um, Poor because if you had any wealth in England, you were probably staying in England because you were from some sort of established family. Um, and then they were generally single, again, because it afforded them the opportunity to strike out on their own and be able to um, sort of up and leave and travel cross country. They didn't have a family that they had to worry about. Um, and so initially, the colonies are almost entirely British, and we use the term British instead of English, just because Britain encompasses more than England. It encompasses Wales and Scotland and Ireland. Although the Irish are a little bit different, and we'll get to that because the Irish are predominantly Catholic, and there's some significant anti-Catholic ideology in the United States. So the Irish are a little bit different, but the Scottish, the Welsh, and the English are all British that are coming here. Now, eventually, you see Swedes, Norwegians, the Dutch, the Germans, a significant number of other European nations. These are all white folks, so we're not really talking about diversity in ethnic immigration. Um, but regardless, there's still our first sort of sense of nativism in the United States. And we're not even in the United States at this point, we're just an English colony. But we do have a first sense of nativism. And nativism is an idea that you'll see replay throughout this, right? So nativism is essentially a sort of pushback against what's seen as almost a foreign invasion, or immigrants that aren't um, that don't have the same background, right? I mean, again, this instance of nativism shows you that it's not just ethnic. It's not just white folks being like, "Wow, we don't want the Chinese to come," right? Like that happens in the 19th century, and we'll get there. But now you have British people, right, or people that are from Britain that are living in the colonies. There's a significant amount of backlash against the Dutch or the Germans that are coming into the colonies. And so this is our first sort of example of nativism. When you look at birth rates and death rates, one, we actually had lower mortality rates than England. Um, but for a variety of reasons, um, some of it the simple fact that we're spread out, right? So um, again, when you're looking at England, and it's obviously not an English history class, but um, England is a very relatively small country. I don't want to say it's a very small country. It's a relatively small country. I think it's about twice the size of New Jersey. Um, but England's also been established for a long time. It's been around for a long time. You have English cities. These cities have people very, very tightly packed into them. And as something we've probably learned here with COVID, um, population density increases disease factor risk, right? So you're at a higher risk of disease. So part of the reason that the U.S. has I call it the U.S., the colonies have a better mortality rate or a longer life expectancy is because we're a little bit more spread out. And so we're not as susceptible to disease because you got to think this is before, um, sort of modern medicine or on some level before medicine period, to where diseases that we could easily recover from today are death sentences in the 18th century. Um, Women in the colonies, because there were very few of them initially, very few. Depending on the colony, it could be as low as 25%, right? So the men might outnumber the women 3 to 1. Um, Colonial women, therefore, tended to get married very, very young. Um, and because they got married young, they tended to have more children. Obviously, because they sort of start the family off at a younger age. So it wouldn't have been abnormal to see a young woman in sort of colonial America married at the age of 14, maybe. Which means that by sort of 18, which is what we think of as adulthood today, this woman might have 2 children and be helping to run a family farm or whatever. Uh, Now, with the 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 early birth, or excuse me, the early marriage and high birth rates, you did have a fairly high infant mortality rate. And so one of the things that people sort of don't understand as it pertains to history, if you go back and you look at data, historical data, and you talk about life expectancy, right? And so life expectancy today is, we'll just make up a number and say it's like 80 years, right? The average person lives to be 80 years old, right? When you go back 200, 300, 400 years ago, right, all of a sudden life expectancy is like half of that, right? Like 40. And so a lot of people are like, dang, man, how come everybody be dying at 40? No, people are not dying at 40. The problem is that you have significantly high infant mortality rates, right? That drastically skew these numbers. Okay, because again, if we have 2 people today, they both live to 80, they die at 80. 80 is the average age of death, right? On the other hand, if one of them lives to 80 and the other one dies at birth, right, or a month into their life, now the average life expectancy becomes 40. And so childhood mortality rates are fairly significant. In fact, one of the sort of speculations is that you would have a significant number of children, one, to ensure that you had children that actually lived into adulthood. Also, when you looked on the sort of frontier aspect of it, children become a source of labor. Especially amongst lower sort of income families that don't have slaves that they can be using for that free labor. Um, as far as women went in the colonies, one, women don't have a lot of opportunity. They don't have a lot of sort of legal rights or standing. They're relegated to sort of the back burner of society. They're not, in a lot of instances, they can't own land. If their husband dies, they better hope that they have a male child that can take over, because things that couldn't even get passed to them in some instances. One of the ways that women found sort of a space in society early on is through religion, and women sort of become almost like the moral center of society. And if you think about it sort of in today's terms, there's still some remnants of this, right? Because when you look at things like purity or chastity or virginity, we tend to hold women to a different standard than what we hold men to. And so there's sort of this, well, boys are just boys, and girls are just girls, and there was this created, as it really is. I mean, we're talking about societal constructs. They're created at some point. This created concept that women are going to be sort of the moral compass of our society. Now, that's not to say that women didn't have any opportunities. There are rare exceptions, and Eliza Pinckney is one of those examples, right? So she is she's the wife of one of the Pinckneys. The Pinckneys are a fairly common, famous family in South Carolina. Um, she ends up, so she marries well. Her husband dies, and she's actually able to sort of take over. She ends up running multiple plantations. A lot of people credit her for sort of the rise. I don't know if it's the start, the rise of indigo as a cash crop in South Carolina. Um, so when you're looking at like cash crops that were grown in the South, it was rice, sugar, tobacco, but indigo is one of them, and specifically in South Carolina, in a large part because of Eliza Pinckney. So there are some examples, some substantial examples of women that are able to overcome some of these limitations that are initially placed on them. When you look at the southern colonies, um, religion was fairly substantial. Religion's actually going to be fairly substantial in much of the colonies, because religion is a one. It's an important aspect of sort of society. It helps draw people together, but also it helps to explain away some of the variations. It helps sort of control a basic morality. Um, so religion does play a role in Southern culture. Probably not quite as much as it does in the New England colonies, but it's still significant in your Southern colonies. There was, however, in the South, a very substantial inequality in terms of wealth. And then with that goes an inequality in social standing. So if you sort of look at the South and how the South began to create, I don't want to say towns, because towns is the wrong word, but how they began to create sort of their society, their culture. It was almost feudal in a sense, where you would have like the plantation owner who has a lot of land and a lot of wealth, and a lot of people in their employ. They'd have a ton of slaves. Well, not a ton. Yeah, I mean, they'd have a number of slaves. But in many instances, they would also have poor whites that were working for them. That might be renting land on their plantation or things of that nature. So the South has a substantial sort of societal gap that we'll talk about more as we move forward in history, because it's going to impact sort of racial relations in the South for a long time. Some of those staple crops we talked about in the last slide, the cash crops. Tobacco obviously was huge in Virginia and North Carolina. Rice and indigo, real big in South Carolina. Sugar down in Georgia. The South, because it was an agrarian society, right? Its structure, its basis is all on agriculture. It requires an extensive amount of labor. And so if you think, I mean, if you might know some friends that are in FFA, or maybe if you've actually been to George Ranch and you've seen sort of how a working ranch goes, you might be aware that ranching or farming is incredibly strenuous work. It's hard work. It's labor intensive work. Yet we have a level of mechanization to it that is just, it would be so foreign to a colonial American is to almost blow their mind. You go back and you think about the number of slaves that it would have taken to hand pick cotton out of cotton plants, and then hand remove the little seed, the thistle, I think it's called a thistle, that was inside the cotton. It's an incredibly slow, arduous, laborious process. And so labor becomes significant. And so colonial slavery in the South becomes wildly significant, because if labor is expensive and immense amounts of labor are required in order to sustain sort of society, the way that society, that agrarian society functions, then the answer ultimately becomes slavery. Why would you not try to decrease labor costs as much as possible? Um, Trade in the southern colonies, um, the South traded extensively with England, and there's some issues, some instances in which England is sort of dictating what can and cannot be traded. The England sort of monopolizes trade, and a lot of times that seems like a good deal for the southern farmers because it's a way to offload their product quickly. Um, but a lot of the times they end up paying middlemen, they end up paying insurance, they end up paying shipping costs, they end up paying all sorts of things that makes that sort of sweetheart deal not nearly as advantageous. You couple that with the fact that the Southerners, in order to sort of maintain their lifestyle, um, most plantations in the South were actually not profitable. They operated essentially off of credit, um, and they maintained a lifestyle. It'll get so bad in some instances in which there's some, what's the word I'm looking for? There's some uh, hint that certain plantations and plantation owners got so desperate economically that they would actually breed slaves. They would intentionally get slaves pregnant in order to be able to sell off the offspring because it would fetch a decent price. And they're that far in debt because they're overextending themselves with England and purchasing a whole bunch of English products. And if you really know anything about sort of commerce, raw material always sells for less than a finished product. And so the South is selling raw material and buying finished product, and that doesn't bode well for them economically. In the New England colonies, so as we move up to the north, the New England colonies, religion was obviously very, very important. A lot of those colonies were established based upon religion. Some of them didn't even practice religious tolerance. Now, as New England begins to expand, and you get more of the Germanic and the Swedish and those groups that are coming in, um, it does get a little bit harder for sort of that puritanical religion to maintain its influence. And so then the New England colonies will become a little bit more tolerant religiously. Um, the New England colonies established themselves or organized themselves is probably the better word into more of sort of what you would think of as a township. So obviously we talked about it just a second ago in the South. You have the plantation, and it was a massive, massive house on a massive amount of land, and then you'd have the little slave quarters down here, and maybe on some other part you would have some housing for some whites that you might rent to and trade their labor. Um, but in New England, you essentially had towns. Um, there weren't large farms. Farming is actually not sustainable in New England, right? You certainly can't have agrarian agriculture. The grow season is too short. The soil is pretty rocky. It's not real good, and so they established sort of towns with like a town square, and a church usually, and then you'd have some houses around that and some merchant shops around that. Um, the like the architecture of the New England colonies is very different than the architecture of the southern colonies. So again, the southern colonies have those massive plantations. Your New England colonies tended to have much smaller homes. Um, I mean, things like the roof, for instance, the roof in a New England home had to be very, very steep in order to ensure that snow would slide off. If you've ever lived anywhere where it snows and it snows heavily for long periods of time, snow actually gets really heavy. You wouldn't necessarily think of it, but it does. It gets really, really heavy. So if you had foot after foot after foot of snow piled on top of a roof, all of that pressure would eventually cause the roof to collapse. And so New England homes had very steep roof lines in order to try to get the snow to slide off and not stay. Because New England colonies were not capable of being agrarian as a result of just conditions, right? That doesn't mean that there was not farming. Understand that there was some farming in New England. You can grow some stuff up there. You can grow some corn, you can grow some potatoes, some things like that. But generally, what was grown was what you would refer to or what you would call sustenance farming, which means that the family has a little farm, a little sort of backyard plot. I mean, homes are on larger plots at this point, but you might have enough. You might be farming enough to feed, your family of 6 or 8 or whatever it is. But you're certainly not selling off this produce. Certainly not shipping it to England. So what New England develops then is in reality, on some level, a capitalist mercantile system even before we're a country, right? You have, merchant shops that are created. You have industry with shipbuilding. There's obviously a massive amount of trees in the New England area at the time, and so those trees are chopped down and milled down and turned into ships. Those ships are then sent out to engage in trade, in the triangular trade. And so while New England might get a pass on slavery because there weren't a lot of slaves in the New England territories, the New England colonies, just because there was no need for the labor, the farming labor is unnecessary there. They're not guiltless in terms of slavery because it's their ships a lot of the times that are helping to bring over Africans to the new colonies, the new world, the Caribbean, Brazil, wherever. This just gives you an idea of some of the trade routes, specifically into North America, right? And so you go from Africa to the United States, to England, or even down to the Caribbean, where you might be getting sugarcane, which the Caribbean is a ton of sugar, right? Some of the more, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, Fantastic, like unbelievable aspects of New England culture. Um, Again, religion was a very significant part of it. You probably have heard about the Salem witch trials, and I think it was 19 people that end up being executed for really a want of evidence. There's not a great deal of information about it. Um, but New England begins to, as the Germanic people come in and the Scandinavian people come in, um, that diversity begins to sort of change the New England colonies. And they're no longer sort of tightly knit families that are based upon religion. And instead, like I think I mentioned a few minutes ago, they're going to have to become a little bit more religiously tolerant. The middle colonies are sort of a mixture, and again, we talked about it sort of geographically, but they're also sort of a mixture economically between the New England colonies and the southern colonies. They do have some economic, commercial, mercantile aspects to it. They fish just like they did in the New England area. I think I forgot to tell you that. But obviously, for food purposes in New England, if you can't grow crops, you got to be able to fish. Um, but there's a lot of fishing in the middle colonies. Um, there is still a fair amount of agrarian influence. Maryland, Virginia's probably more southern. Maryland, Delaware, Jersey, Pennsylvania, really, you can still grow a fair amount of crops up there. The middle colonies also become, and this is in large part because of the Quakers and because of William Penn. Penn was very, very open. The Quakers were very open. They were very accepting of others. And so the middle colonies, even more so than New England, are one of those sort of safe havens for specifically non-English um, uh, uh, immigrants, right? And a lot of the times, what will happen is they'll you enter through Ellis Island, which is in New York City. Um, they would make their way, across into New Jersey and then into Pennsylvania, and they would generally go west, almost to the Appalachian Mountains, and then start trekking south, um, because this was the area that was unsettled, and so this was the area that afforded them the best opportunity to lay claim to some land, build a house, create a little farm, and so a lot of these Germanic and Dutch and Nordic peoples end up populating what we call at the time the backcountry, right? So obviously the coastline is where the majority of commerce happens, it's where the majority of the population lives. The Appalachian Mountains is actually a barrier at the time, right? Like there's a decree by the English not to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the Appalachian Mountains, if you don't know where they are, they basically run from western New York down almost at a 45-degree angle, down through Pennsylvania, West Virginia. The state of West Virginia is pretty much all Appalachian Mountains. Western Virginia, the little like heel to it or whatever you want to call it, Western North Carolina, and even Western and Northern Georgia, right? And so that's the line. So there's a significant amount of land between the coastline and the Appalachian Mountains. And this is what we call the backcountry, which is where a lot of these people settle. And this map just gives you an idea of well, one, it shows you the Appalachian Mountains, but it also just gives you an idea of where a lot of these people are settling. Slavery in the colonies, obviously, we know that there's slavery. We know the 1619 Project has brought a lot of this to light. If you haven't read the 1619 Project, you haven't paid attention to it, it's probably worth perusing, but just realize that any history that's a narrative history is generally going to have an agenda, and so just make sure that you're looking at all aspects of it and all aspects of what they're telling you. Obviously, we have slavery in the colonies. It's African slavery. It's racial. It's color-based prejudice. There's nothing around that. Even some of the early abolitionists, while they were not okay with the institution of slavery, they didn't think that blacks were their equal either. So there's a significant amount of prejudice that exists in all of that. The slaves were taken to market. They were sold, sort of similar to how you would think of cattle being done today. That doesn't mean that slaves accepted it or didn't fight back. But slaves would frequently try to run away. There are a number of sort of entries from Southern whites that talk about the various slaves that were constantly running away, despite the fact that when caught, they would be beaten. When caught, there's actually laws that said they had to be returned to the plantation where they left from or from their master. But in addition to running away, there were instances of armed revolt as well. And so you should have just read an article about the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, which is one of the better examples of slaves not just sort of accepting their lot in life. We do get around this time, so around the 1750s, we do begin to sort of create a culture. We begin to have at times some common understandings. Our colonial cities, our coastal cities, which are our ports. Obviously, ports are very important because it's where a lot of trade is happening, right? Ships come in, they offload their goods, buy and sell and trade and load up with new goods and then go somewhere else. It helps to create a political and social order. We begin to have sort of a structured class-based society. Even in New England, I mean, in the South, obviously, you have you're sort of very, very wealthy plantation owners, and then your poor whites. In the middle colonies in New England, your merchant class gives rise to a middle class, but they still have their super wealthy and their sort of impoverished. Um, we begin to create more roads around this time as well as we're trying to link cities to one another, and we're trying to create more of a unified sort of common experience amongst the colonies. And so as we begin to create roads and widen roads, those give rise to taverns, which are essentially, a lot of the times they would be like a bed and breakfast today. Like you could get a room at a tavern a lot of the times, and they were essentially stopping posts between your travels. A lot of times, obviously, you can get a beer there. You can, trade sort of stories, get the latest gossip. There might be local papers there that you would be able to read to keep up on the local news. But it was a way for travelers to have a little bit more safety, a little bit more structure to extended trips. Um, the the colonies, again, despite the fact that we're creating sort of this more unified or more common colonial ideology, the colonies need people. They actually actively compete for people. And they compete for people because people are ultimately a commodity and they create wealth, and the colonies want to create wealth. Again, if you remember, I mean, some of these colonies were created as joint stock companies. They were created in order to create wealth. Um, so you see you see some colonies um, trying to actively recruit the Dutch or the Germans or whomever. That does lead, because we talked about, we already have some uh, naturalisms issues, right? So, or nativist, excuse me, that's the word I'm looking at. With nativist issues, right? Um, the British are going to come up with sort of a naturalization process, right? And so, if you come into the colonies, what's it actually going to take for you to be able to stay and sort of establish citizenship and whatnot? By the 1760s, I think, Jews are actually allowed to come to the United States and or to the colonies and sort of immigrate and then go through that naturalization process. The Enlightenment, which occurs around about this time, is wildly significant. And you'll learn about it probably more next year when you take government. But the Enlightenment is a new way of thinking that encompasses a wide variety of things, but a large part of it is political in nature, and sort of it looks at concepts of rights and laws, and um, they become very, very important to the founding of the country, because these are the things that people were thinking about as we fought for our independence and then as we go to create our own government. But the Enlightenment is another sort of scientific revolution, sort of another renaissance, if you will. It's all about knowledge, scientific reasoning, logic, and trying to understand sort of factually the world we live in rather than just accepting it upon, um, faith, right? Franklin is a really big part of this. So Franklin is an Enlightenment thinker. He's the sort of elder statesman of founding fathers, as you think about it. He's actually fairly advanced in age by the time we get to the founding of the country. But Franklin is absolutely an intellectual, and he's trying to do things like figure out electricity. He invents bifocals. He actually in I don't know if it's invents or creates, but he essentially redesigns the stove to keep the heat in longer. So obviously, as you burn wood in the stove, that heat rises out of the chimney and escapes the house. Franklin actually creates a stove that essentially brings it back in and it holds that heat in longer. But he's a really good example of sort of the American in the American impact on the Enlightenment and how sort of the colonial Enlightenment unfolded. Um, some of this is due to education. Um, so in the North, for instance, education began relatively early. Again, we talked about in the New England areas, you had sort of the church that was the town center, and you had homes sort of or surrounding it, encompassing it. You had sort of communities, small communities that actually gave rise to things like public education. A lot of the times it happened at the church, but people would send their children, and their children would learn to read and write, and it was emphasized in the New England colonies because you needed to learn how to read and write in order to read the scriptures. Um, the in the South, education doesn't play quite as a prominent role. Generally, wealthy planters, wealthy landowners, the plantation owners, they might have private tutors for their children, but your sort of backcountry folk, your smaller farmers, their children are, as soon as they're sort of old enough, are being put to work on the farm, and education is not quite as important there. Um, the Great Awakening is sort of a religious revival. And so when you have something like the Enlightenment, a Great Awakening is generally right around the corner. The minute you begin to sort of try to prove God, for lack of a better term, right? Like we're trying to do everything intellectually. We're focusing on logic. We're focusing on the scientific method. You're going to have some pushback from religion because religion is faith-based. It is by its very nature unproven. You cannot prove religion. You'll never be able to prove religion. And so you had, established churches that are, I don't want to say overrun is the wrong word, but you have these sort of traveling preachers that will come in to these established churches and deliver these very fiery sermons and talk about spirituality and emphasize how important it is to be born again and to change your heart and to focus on your spiritual well-being and your emotional well-being and try to discount at least a little bit that sort of intellectual process that we get through the Enlightenment. Whitfield is just another, probably don't even really need this slide, but he's simply another one of those new preachers, right? Those evangelists preaching, born again, redemption. Some of them a little bit more fire and brimstone than others, but ultimately focusing on that concept of a spiritual, emotional revival and emphasis and a pushback on the Enlightenment. And so then ultimately what happens, because the Great Awakening does have some very lasting impact on sort of society, right? The radical evangelicals are able to make some headway. They're able to change how some people think. They do begin to sort of re-emphasize some of those traditional aspects of society. Women, again, we talked about this at the very beginning of the PowerPoint. So women are sort of the moral authority. And so this affords women more of an opportunity to get involved and to participate. Um, you actually have a number of colleges, and I don't remember all of their original names, but what Princeton, Dartmouth, Brown, Rutgers, they're all established around about this time, and they're actually religious universities. So the oldest university in America is Harvard. It's founded in something like 1630, 38, I think. I don't remember the exact year. I don't care. Um, but Harvard, Yale, maybe, and William and Mary, I think, all exist prior to the Great Awakening. But the Great Awakening sees a significant increase in um, sort of education, but specifically religious education. And so you see sort of a rise in sort of theological, philosophical, um, liberal education that's not so focused on the maths and science. I can't speak maths and sciences of academia. But if you look at some of the more elite sort of Ivy League schools today, a lot of them can trace their heritage back to this Great Awakening and to actually being founded as religious schools. So this takes us to the end of sort of the colonial period. And what we'll pick up with on our next PowerPoint is sort of the early seeds of the rebellion and ultimately what will be the revolution. So you have your first test this coming Friday. Good luck. I'm sure you'll do fine.